recording as well. Okay, I think we can make a start now. I know there are a couple of people still to come, but they'll join us as soon as they're able. So I'd like to welcome you all to this, our fifth talk in this sustainability politics seminar here at Brunel University. The first four talks in the series, they each focused on technologies from a variety of disciplines and vantage points, including engineering, including material science. But we haven't yet addressed technology itself critically and philosophically. This week, however, we're very lucky to have Alf Hornborg with us to do just that. Alf teaches human ecology at Lund University. By training, he's an anthropologist. His ethnography was largely in North and South America. His publications center, I think, on a series of books: The Power of the Machine, Global Magic, and several others. These are books that develop a critique of the contemporary world economy and its genesis, a critique that centers on concepts of machine fetishism and unequal ecological exchange. Now, Alf has been a seminal thinker in fashioning these and various other concepts into tools that help us get to grips with contemporary society's environmental predicament, as it could be called, although pretty much any such term is a wild understatement. Now, the title of his talk today is Dismantling the Machine, Rethinking Technology in the Anthropocene. Nicely rhymes. Alf will have the floor for half an hour or so. After that, there'll be a Q&A. So after he finishes, do click the raise hand button if you'd like to ask a question or make a point. So over to you, Alf.
Thank you very much. And I want to begin by thanking Gareth here for inviting me. It's nice to be here, and I'm sitting here in Västervik on the east coast of Sweden, enjoying the view over the harbor. So this is the new way of organizing seminars. Problematic is the technology, and it's fitting because this is a seminar about technology. I want to apologize for the blue hue that you see in my screen. I look like one of these Nawi from the Avatar movie, if you've seen that. I just bought a new camera, but to no avail. So you're going to have to suffer this through. Also, the PowerPoint is that I intend to share with you is not working quite properly. So this is the technology's way of getting back at me, I think, for all the vicious, nasty books I've been writing about machinery over the past 20 years. Well, yes, I want to talk about technology as a general phenomenon. And I tell you, it's quite a challenge to try in 30 minutes to say something about ideas that have been preoccupying me for the past 30 years, I would argue. And I had these ideas swirling around in my head because I'm right now working on the final pages of a book for Routledge, the subtitle of which will be Technology as a Transformation of Slavery. And that's a theme that will, I guess, be topmost in my mind, and I hope we'll be able to talk about that when we get into the discussion period. But in trying to compress all these ideas into 30 minutes, I'm bound to forget some vital, crucial steps in my thinking. So I look forward to you identifying those missing links, and I hope to be able to respond to them further on. Now, I know in these times we're not supposed to adopt grand narratives, as it were, but I suppose in a way it's precisely a grand narrative that I am trying to produce. I want to say something about technology in general. And maybe this sounds very old-fashioned, but I guess what I want to do is to suggest that technology is not what we think it is. It's something else than what we think it is. And I like to connect to a concept that I, as a graduate student in anthropology, learned in the 1980s, which is defamiliarization. It was Marcus and Fisher wrote a book called Anthropology as Cultural Critique in the mid-80s, 1986, I think. And they used the word defamiliarization. And I like the word because I think that's what we anthropologists can do in modern societies. We can defamiliarize, we can make the familiar seem unfamiliar. And I guess that's what I've been trying to do about technology for a long time. I also think that the current global situation we are in now is really calling out for a radical rethinking of our entire industrial civilization. We have climate change, we have escalating global inequalities, and so on. So I think we should be prepared for really radically new perspectives on what we're up to. And I have a strong feeling that we really don't know what we're up to, but we will find out over the next few decades. Yeah, I'm gonna try to share screen here. I hope you see this. Can somebody show me a thumbs up or something like that? Gareth, is this?
Yeah, we do see
okay,
that.
Okay, right, great. I apologize for showing all these previews to the left, but try to forget about them. This is the topic that I chose, dismantling the machine, rethinking technology in the Anthropocene. And this is basically what I thought was going to be the title of my Rutledge book. But as usual, the publishers will not accept that title because they want to have easily searchable words. So I've changed it around, but the subtitle at least is going to be Technology as a Transformation of Slavery, as I said before. And I'd like to start by, I'm going to mention some of the basic points that I think are important to this argument. And the first one is this very close correlation between the distribution of money and technology in the world. The top map is actually a map of GDP density. It shows you where most of the money is being made in the world per square kilometer. And the bottom image is a composite satellite image from NASA showing the world from outer space, viewed from a satellite. Of course, you can't see the whole world at once, so it's composite. There are thousands of images put together. What it shows is nighttime lights, and I've used these nighttime lights as a proxy for the distribution of industrial infrastructure, or techno mass, as I call it. So you can see that the distribution of technology correlates very closely with the distribution of money. And there are, as you see, three core areas, North America, Europe, and Eastern Asia, where both money and technology are very strongly concentrated. What I want to challenge primarily is the illusion, which I think is very widespread in modern society, that technology, or the machine, as I call it, is basically only a matter of applying human ingenuity to nature. So that, for example, if we should understand the Industrial Revolution in Britain. This is, by the way, a blueprint of James Watt's steam engine. We should understand the Industrial Revolution as a matter of ingenuity, as a matter of innovations, brilliant people innovating, creating new technologies and applying them to nature, of course, also in symbiosis with science, which is producing new knowledge of nature. Basically, to view technology as a cognitive phenomenon, as something that has to do with ideas, innovations, and so on. And I want to challenge this by thinking of technology not so much as an idea. I think all people at all times have had good ideas, but technology is primarily, for me, a very material phenomenon. And it's, to me, an object of social theory, which remarkably, I would argue it is not. I've been scrutinizing, for example, development theory, economic history, Marxist theory, all kinds of discourses, and looking for a kind of a social metabolic understanding of technology as not only a brilliant system of ideas, but as a material process. And I've found none, really. I think that even Marxist theory, which prides itself on being historically materialist, holds on to a very mainstream distinction between productive forces and social relations of production, one material, the other social, as if they were somehow insulated from each other, as if the productive forces were ways of harnessing nature, and this being in no sense social, but completely natural. So I think the dichotomy of society and nature is very fundamental to this illusion that the technology belongs to nature. It's a matter of harnessing natural forces. Rather than understanding those technologies for harnessing natural forces as being products of social processes of accumulation. Of course, Marx was extremely aware of those processes of capital accumulation, but still he must have conceptually distinguished the machine from capital, technology from capital, because he welcomed the development of new technologies under capitalism, and saw that as something separate from capitalism, which he wanted to transcend. We know that the Industrial Revolution in Britain was very much geared to the trade in cotton textiles, and the main markets for those cotton textiles were actually slave traders in West Africa and slave owners in the Americas, who wanted the cheap textiles. And of course, the very same slaves picked the cotton, the raw cotton, for the factories in Britain. So I want us to think of the Industrial Revolution as being a global manifestation of, a local manifestation, of a global metabolic process that was so much more encompassing than just applying bright ideas to nature. So this is how I would like us to rethink technology. I hope to get back to the issue of slavery in a little while. If we look at modern statistics, this is a series of diagrams compiled by a colleague of mine, Christian Dorninger, showing that although mainstream economists are focused entirely on money and market equilibrium, we can analyze trade statistics to show that in material terms, beyond the horizons of mainstream economics, world trade is very material, although this dimension of world trade is more or less irrelevant to neoclassical economic theory. Christian Dorninger was able to show that in the year 2007, the three core areas of the world system that we saw in that satellite image are net importers of at least 4 different kinds of biophysical resources that have been embodied in the commodities. In other words, they have been expended, dissipated in producing those commodities. So they're, in a sense, inscribed in the commodities. The commodities represent all these spent resources. You can see that the white columns here represent net imports. The gray columns represent imports, the black columns exports, and the white columns is the difference. That is the net import. And you can see that in all the four diagrams, we're talking about these three areas: the European Union, Japan, and the United States. And in all these 12 cases, actually, there is a net import to these core areas. They are net receivers of biophysical resources. And it's amazing, really, to understand that mainstream economics shows very little interest in this aspect of world trade. I would argue that these asymmetric resource transfers in the world system are absolutely essential in order to understand what technology is. Technology is a concentration and accumulation of productive potential, which is contingent on these asymmetric resource flows. And I believe that this is something that was initiated with the Industrial Revolution, when the outsourcing of European resource requirements created the possibilities of devising completely new technological systems. So that this quantum leap in the late 18th century was not just about breakthroughs in engineering, but about the integration of a new world system, making it possible to draw your resources, your embodied labor, embodied materials, embodied energy, and so on, from other parts of the world. This can be very simply demonstrated with this diagram, which basically shows that this is also a question of thermodynamics. The global technomass, as I call it, relies on physically unequal exchange. This is in agreement with the entropy law, the so-called, or the second law of thermodynamics, which says that any ordered structure, and it's particularly useful to understanding biological organisms, needs a constant net input of high order matter and energy, which it dissipates simply by metabolizing, simply by existing, and discharging low order matter energy, that is entropy. It generates entropy simply by existing. And I would argue that this is a way of understanding not only biomass, but also technomass. And the difference is, of course, that in the case of technomass, the relation between these two arrows, the proportion between them, is regulated by market prices. This does not apply to living things, of course, but the technomass requires certain ratios of resource exchange on the world market, and those ratios are regulated by market prices. Let's see, yeah. I argue also that it would be impossible to understand technology without understanding the market and all-purpose money, which to me suggests a kind of magic, a kind of alchemy. From the perspective of each individual market actor, there is a conversion going on. Your own time into somebody else's time, one kind of substance for another kind of substance. It's absolutely self-evident to us that this is the way money should work. But if you take a step back, like anthropologists are supposed to do, it really assumes the appearance of a very magical idea. And it's not a coincidence that when coined money first appeared in ancient Greece, it was thought of as a magical amulet, precisely because it had this strange property of being convertible into almost anything. Now, we no longer think of money as magical, but in some ways it certainly is. And without the magic of the market, we would not have these miraculous technologies. We are importing, of course, a lot of labor time, as illustrated by this image, but also natural resources, materials, energy, embodied land, and so on. Like I said before, this is, I think, a problem that needs to be addressed and theorized in the Marxist tradition. I'm very influenced by Marxist theory, and some basic ideas like fetishism, for example, is completely crucial to my argument. But I do find that in Marxist theory, there is this tendency to insulate technology from social relations or production. I very rarely hear Marxist colleagues conceding that the improvements in productivity in early 19th century British factories was actually subsidized by low-wage labor and cheap resources from other parts of the world system. This is something that would have, I think, changed the idea of the understanding of productive forces in Marxist theory. And to put it very drastically, I think we are reaching the insight that technology is, in a sense, capital, that the accumulation that became so evident in 19th century Britain was very much about the accumulation of technology. So here's my final slide. I wanted to get back to the issue of slavery, I said, and this is really an intriguing issue. We can go back to Aristotle, who several centuries BC had this idea about automata of machines, of slaves that worked by themselves, that non-human slaves. In a way, it was a vision of replacing slaves with machines. And I think we have been trying to do that ever since. And I wonder, I mean, the general idea is that given all modern machinery we've had over the past 250 years, we have been able to transcend slavery, leave it behind. Historically, we have moved on to something else. Now it's the machines working. But what I'm suggesting is that those machines are, in fact, transmutations of slavery. The people working in the global South, in the mines, in the plantations, in the sweatshops, for a fraction of the salaries that we're used to in Europe, are basically slaves. And the machines we have in the global North are transmutations of their work. The work conducted by these machines are transformations of the work conducted by the 79% of industrial workers of the world who are in the global South, working for very low wages. So that Aristotle's vision has, in a sense, become true, but at the same time, the machines that we have all around us obscure the fact that we're still stuck with slavery. We're still stuck with a social distribution of workloads and environmental loads, which is organized through the market, through money, and not least through technology. And this image, which is of a robot, as you can see, indicates that now that we're moving into artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on, we're moving further and further into this old vision of replacing humans with machines. But we're doing it as we are obscuring for ourselves and forgetting about the fact that behind those machines, there are millions of low-wage people working to keep them going. I have a colleague, for example, who showed that this is very true of the new social media, all these tech giants who are producing new technologies for experiencing the world, which are not just digital miracles, but very much based on low-wage labor in the global south. Okay, I think it's time to stop there.
Great, thanks very much for this very thought-provoking set of reflections on technology, Alf. We've now got half an hour or so available for Q&A. While people are thinking of questions to ask, just press the hand raise button when you think of one. I'll just kick off with a couple of questions for you while others are thinking. The first one is on the environmental crisis and technology as a magic bullet. You know, last year in the run-up to COP26, John Kerry, who was Joe Biden's climate ambassador, he said something like, to confront climate change will require, above all, new technologies. Half of them haven't even been invented yet, which struck me as being remarkably cavalier, faced with this crisis of incredible dimensions. Just almost blasé. He's talking of, I guess, things like carbon capture and storage, nuclear fusion, those sorts of things. Now, my question is the way in which these technologies are being discussed in the climate debate by John Kerry and others, do you think that is adequately covered or relates well to the concept of magic? In what sense is this magical thinking, I suppose? It's clearly ideological, but is it magical? And if so, in what sense? And my second question to you concerns your discussion of the Marxist tradition. So you had a slide where Marx's Capital, I think it was there next to Bastani's book on, fully automated luxury nonsense. And you suggest that for Marx, technology is insulated from social relations of production, treated as neutral. But if you read Marx on technology, read him on machines and Capital, look at the words, the metaphors he uses: monster, autocrat, Cyclops, etc. He's very aware that machines are integrated into a particular social system, and his critique of capitalism is that in this social system, the machines are turned against the humans who operate them. And as part of the same question, you suggest that it's unusual to hear among Marxists that the Industrial Revolution was sort of subsidized by slavery. But the Eric Williams thesis, I think, is very widely accepted among Marxists. So I just press you on those two questions: magic bullets and Marxist machines.
Yeah, right.
On machinery.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. Yeah, the first issue, I agree. It's quite problematic the way technology is believed to be the magic bullet, and I mean there have been plenty of reflections on the way in which technology is treated as a kind of a religion. I'm thinking of David Noble's book, for example, on technology as religion, and you certainly see a lot of that, I think, today. I can just say from a Swedish perspective now that the rage now is to have electric cars, of course, and photovoltaic panels, and it seems like the discussion about where the atmosphere is going is sort of obscured by this discussion of shifting to cars, electric cars, and solar panels. Whereas we all know somewhere deep inside that the photovoltaic panels that are being used in Europe now are most of them built in China with very low wage labor, and the extraction of minerals to produce them is also problematic. The same thing goes for the electric cars. We know that the cobalt and so on is mined in Congo, much of it, and I think it's worrisome that people should think that we'll be able to get out of the problems created by technology by using more technology. And in this way, I think we're stuck in the same ideology that brought us fossil fuels, the Industrial Revolution. And now we're thinking of leaving the Industrial Revolution using the same approach, that more technology will solve the problem. Okay, the other question about Marx, I agree completely with you. I've been very much looking for something in Marx and Marxist theory that I was hoping to find, but unable to find. The notion that the productive forces which are celebrated by Marx, the expansion of the productive forces, are really very much contingent on unequal exchange in the world system. And this is something that I am unable to find. I've been looking at sections on machinery where Marx really celebrates the new kinds of machines that will be able to emancipate the working class. Yet I don't think he really considers the extent to which those machines were contingent on miners and plantation workers in the global South. And in that sense, I believe he excised technology from its global context. And as showing the cover of Bastani's book simply illustrates how wrong that can lead you. I mean, the idea that technology, I mean, Bastani's argument is basically that Marxists have always liked technology and production and so on. So let's just continue. And he sounds like any eco-modernist at all, finally. And he even gets to the point where he says that technology is immaterial. He says that in so many words, that technology is basically a question of ideas, of information. And that takes you very far away from historical materialism, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks very much. Eric, could you, Eric followed by Will, if we could.
There we go. Yes, thanks for a very stimulating presentation there. My question concerns your discussion of slavery. And obviously, this was a half-hour presentation. You didn't have much time to sort of go into much detail about, your notion of slavery. But I was wondering in your book whether it's kind of more nuanced, because I was thinking that the Industrial Revolution in the UK. I mean, you mentioned repeatedly about cheap labor in the global South, but obviously in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, you had very cheap labor in the UK being used to run the mills, mine the resources, the coal and so on here. I mean, up until quite recently. And that, this has all been transferred to the global South because of cheaper wages. So I suppose my question is, do we need, or do you distinguish between what we might call real slavery, where, I mean, somebody is, taken on a slave ship, they're chained up, they're a non-person, so to speak, and people who are in a low wage situation, living in maybe just above poverty, but are able at some point to kind of come out of that and, maybe improve their situation. It seems like the whole notion of slavery is being kind of glossed over as just one thing.
Mm. Yes, right. I do believe that I'm going to have to do some more research on this, though. But I know that Britain was much ahead of the United States, its former colonies, in abolishing slavery, and I believe that the commodification of labor that occurred in the late 18th, early 19th century was somehow more efficient for the purposes of British industrialization than slavery. I know that a lot of people argue that the abolition of slavery was really an act of philanthropy, but I wonder if that really is the case. It may have seemed so on the surface, but basically, when you think of the condition that you mentioned, Eric, the conditions of British laborers at that time, who were basically starving. It was. It seems like an economically better deal to allow the market to run its course with labor rather than have to maintain a repressive infrastructure, chains and whips and so on, and overseers to keep the slaves in check. So in that sense, I argue that machinery and the commodification of labor that was actually fundamental to machinery could be seen as a transformation of slavery, of real slavery, so that what had previously been a coercive control of labor was turned into market coercion, and which is quite as coercive. I mean, it has proven itself quite as coercive as whips and chains. And of course, you wouldn't have the risk of slave rebellions and so on. So that would be my preliminary answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And Will?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, just looking for the mute button, unmute button. Well, no, I also enjoyed this very much. I thought it was very, very, as Eric says, stimulating and interesting. I guess my question was about this equation that you're drawing between technology and capital, which on one hand, and I can see talking about industrial technology, yeah, clearly that's, I suppose if you run a business, then your technology is a productive asset and you'd classify it as capital. But I wondered how well this argument worked, or how the argument worked, how you saw it working with the sorts of distributed technologies that you and I deal with, which are not just capital, but also commodities and objects of desire, and they get deployed through social life, and I suppose what are quite interesting ways as ways to make people productive, but also as sources of pleasure or what have you. And I wondered how those sorts of devices played into this argument.
Well, maybe we use the word technology in different senses here. Could you exemplify what you mean by this other kind of technology?
Well, I mean, you mentioned electric cars, but I mean, really, I was thinking about personal computing technology, which is at the same time something that, is always on, and you can answer your emails at 12 o'clock at night, and that increases your productivity. But at the same time, it's clearly a commodity rather than something that you're acquiring as capital.
Yeah, it's funny. It's by coincidence, I was reading yesterday a couple of papers on the new digital technologies. Astra Taylor wrote a piece called the automation charade. And we have a Swedish colleague whose name is Kristina Gratorp, who's also written a piece called Time to Automate. And what they have in common is that they're critically looking at, I think both of them have been working in like with the high tech, the tech giants like Facebook and so on, and they know that there are thousands, if not millions, of low-wage labor people working in the South to keep these digital miracles working, operating, so that what to us looks like a miraculous technology, for example, like we're using right now, is basically the tip of the iceberg and builds on a lot of exploited labor throughout the world, from the mining to the checking of contents on Facebook servers. And I mean, there are millions of people involved. So we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. That's how I would respond, I think.
Okay, thank you. Any further hands? I should emphasize that our guests, as well, in addition to colleagues from Brunel, guests are very welcome to ask questions as well. So do raise your hand if you have anything you'd like to say. Ivan.
Hi, just following from the previous question, I feel very out of my depth here as a media scholar.
I can't hear you anymore. Are you muted? Or?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Now, yes.
Okay. Sorry, just in relation to following to the previous comment, the idea of slavery displaced in the global south of the world through technology, it just doesn't completely capture for me, for example, what happens with everyday technology today, particularly with free digital labor. And I'm thinking about technologies in this sense, as social media, as we producer of contents that at the same time constantly, that are not just capital for some, but are also objects of desire. And by now we know literally how cycles of dopamines in our brain work through this technology, so that we are hooked technically to keep producing. And this is not to diminish the distinction that was done before in relation easy slavery. And I think that's a notion of slavery in this sense is capable of capturing how widespread across the two poles this is, right? If that makes sense.
Well, I think you're talking a lot about, it sounded to me like you're talking about consumption of technology rather than the production of the technology. I mean, I completely agree that we're being manipulated to buy all this stuff, and we want, like smartphones and so on. But what I'm talking about is how these artifacts are produced, through which global commodity chains are they produced, and using labor at what wage level and so on. Did I respond to your question there, or? Well.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. I guess.
You're muted.
No, I was just saying, I guess I was thinking in terms of, yes, we do not necessarily produce technology, but we do produce contents for these technologies every day. And to separate the content from the technology itself, I think from my point of view, it's a complex web, right? To separate, it's almost like just because we don't produce the phones, the fact that we produce our tweets, we're not embedded in the production of technology. It's and yeah.
Yeah, well, certainly I when I'm writing on my laptop, I'm producing content, yes, but without the people laboring to create this laptop for me, I would really not be able to write very much at all. So I do think that's very secondary to the production of the actual technology for writing, I would argue. I would, yeah, okay.
Isaac.
Just two things. The first is an argument which I lost. I once argued with someone that slavery was abolished in the United States. It's not. Slavery is legal according to the United States Constitution.
Wow.
The Constitution says that slavery is abolished except for a person who is incarcerated. So people in jail are still legally slaves.
Wow.
And this constitutional lawyer read the piece from the Constitution to me. So that is an interesting thing which we tend to forget. And that prison labor in the US was a very important form of labor exploitation for a very long time. And if we look today at the number of people in prisons and the kind of labor that prisoners do, that is something that complicates the picture. The US has enormous amounts of people incarcerated and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what I remember about Marx. When I was a student, we only read Marx. We weren't allowed to read anything else. Then he said about slavery that the slave was part of the means of production. No, the slave was not was seen as part of the means of production. So that places the slave in the same conceptual framework as the technology. So that I agree with you. You are bringing something new to it, but I think Marx had the slave in the same conceptual framework as technology, because technology is also seen as the means of production, not the actual labor.
Well, it's interesting that, I mean, this has such a long history in Western tradition, this idea of viewing slaves as objects, as means of production. I mean, it goes back to Rome, Roman law, and ancient Greece. I mentioned Aristotle. So it's not surprising that it was still with us as Marx was elaborating his theory. But I was thinking of what Gareth was saying before about how Eric Williams acknowledged these global connections. But the interesting thing for me is not so much acknowledging colonialism and imperialism and unequal exchange and whatever. The interesting thing is, to what extent does this acknowledgement of global asymmetries actually contaminate our image of what technology is? And that's where I think the Marxist framework does not go far enough. That's the big difference. Of course, I mean, Marxists are very well aware of all the asymmetries of the world system. It's from them that I've learned all I know about that. But the question is, the next step is, what does this imply for our understanding of what technology is? And this is something that I think now in the Anthropocene, we really need to understand. We have a technological infrastructure that is destroying the planetary biosphere. We're told we have to get rid of the old categories of nature versus society. Well, then we also really need to rethink technology, which has been so unequivocally relegated to the realm of nature, but which is social through and through. And it's the profundity of that insight that I want to pursue.
Thanks. We've potentially still got another few minutes left on the clock. If there are any final questions that anyone present would like to ask.
I can ask another one.
Thanks.
I can ask another one.
Over to you.
Okay. What was interesting to me is it's not merely John Kerry who was talking about the technologies, but also Elizabeth Warren. And in the US, a lot of the US dominance or hegemony is seen as the control of technology. And a lot of the technology is based on oil and fossil fuel. And it's not just the technology, but also the US capital. The strength of the US economy lies on the strength of the dollar, and oil is sold in dollar. So when we move out of a fossil fuel economy, then it's a threat to US hegemony. So Warren's idea was to invest billions of dollars in the manufacture of new kind of green technology, so that the US controls the green technology as well, and it perpetuates its hegemony. And I think that was behind her idea.
Do you want me to comment that? Yeah. I mean, for me, it's been obvious actually for many years, at least from a Swedish perspective, how we have tried to become sustainable or green in Sweden, for example, by displacing work and environmental loads to other parts of the world. About 15 years ago, everybody was talking about biofuels, how we were supposed to mix ethanol into our tanks and so on. And even then I found it strange that by converting the Brazilian Cerrado into sugarcane fields, we were becoming sustainable in our automobility in Europe. And recent technological innovations have simply maintained the same pattern. We are displacing our carbon emissions also to other parts of the world and claiming that now we have decoupled economic growth from carbon emissions, while what we've actually been doing is displacing them. So I remain very skeptical to these ideas about green new technologies, because they don't really acknowledge the extent to which technologies are always distributive phenomena. They're always a kind of a zero-sum game, or at least they have elements of a zero-sum logic to them. So this is certainly very evident in all the deliberations on climate change, and I've actually stopped following those COP meetings because I find they're saying the same thing over and over again. I don't think that carbon capture and storage or direct air capture or anything like that is going to solve the global problem that we're facing now.
All right, thanks very much, Alf, and thanks, guys, to all of you for sacrificing an hour of your Friday. I use guys advisedly, since as Sana has left us, I think everyone, judging roughly by names, everyone in the Zoom is of the male persuasion. But and perhaps I should have asked a question about gender division of labor, social reproduction, and the cheapening of labor by these means, and how that fits into your overarching theory alongside slavery and race and uneven development.
I just say something in relation to that, because there's really no body of theory that is quite as incisive in terms of understanding technology as displaced labor as some of the ecofeminist theory, the ecofeminist criticism of technology. So that's gender aspect for you. Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Well, finally then, thanks to Alf for coming all this way. And I hope, Alf, you're prepared to admit that technology does have its advantages in ways such as this.
Well, if we try to forget the fact that I'm blue and so on, yes, this is amazing. Now I'm going to have a cup of tea and I'm right at home. I didn't even have to go to Britain to talk with you guys. Okay.
Though we would have loved that, of course. Well, and thanks to all the colleagues from Brunel
yes.
and guests from abroad for turning up as well. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.